One of the kinds of questions that comes up quite regularly on exam papers is the question about themes. Choose a novel that has an important theme. And loneliness is a really good one to be able to write about because there's so much to say. And it's also one of those themes that examiners like to feel you can make some kind of a personal response to. Of Mice and Men's social commentary, it tells us about what life was like in 1930s America for George and Lenny and for men like them. And it deals with this theme that guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. I think you can immediately see that it's one of the big issues that Steinbeck is addressing. The boss says when he meets George and Lenny, "I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy." He comments on the fact that these two are different because they actually do kind of look out for each other and travel together. So if we start by having a look at George gives us that line about guys like us that work on ranches, and he's kind of generalising about every other ranch worker in order to be able to say to Lenny that they are different because they look after each other. I got you to look after me, you got me to look after you, although it's George that actually does all the looking after. But he also says when he's talking to Slim later that it's a lot nicer to go around with a guy that you know. And he has this theory that he's seen other guys that work on ranches and that after a long time they get mean. And George seems to feel that being lonely has that kind of negative effect on men's characters. George believes that Lenny keeps him safe from that's kind of the benefit to him of having Lenny around. And that probably stems from the fact that he talks about the lessons he learnt about not being mean to Lenny when they were younger and he used to tell him to jump in rivers and things. Lenny has actually had a positive effect on George's character. So it makes it all the more horrible, really, that by the time you get to the end of the novel, George has lost Lenny. He's been forced to shoot him rather than watch him suffer a horrible death at Curley's hands. And George is now far worse off, I think, than he would have been if he'd never had Lenny. It's that thing about you don't know what you've got till it's gone. When George has lost Lenny, he is worse off because he's known the value of having a friend. Crooks is a character that we know is desperately lonely. He's totally isolated because he's black. He's not even allowed in the bunkhouse. And he is well aware of his own isolation and the effect it has on his mental health. And he's very eloquent about it. Steinbeck makes it clear that Crooks is an intelligent man. Symbolically, he puts this across with his gold-rimmed glasses and the fact that he has books. He's the only character who actually owns a real book, where the rest have magazines. Crooks has books of law. He's clearly a clever man. But he knows that talking to somebody else and having somebody to talk to is essential to his mental health. And he says, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. And he's not talking about physically sick, he's talking about mental illness. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. And then he talks about himself quite candidly to Lenny, so he knows it's probably not going anywhere, but he says that there are times when he's been in the barn on his own at night and he thinks he's seen things and he just wishes he'd had somebody else there with him to tell him he'd just been dreaming. He also talks about the guys that he's seen who've come through who want a little bit of land, and he says, I've seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land. And this is really interesting because he kind of seems to equate the longing for land with the longing for companionship. But he then goes on to state an important difference because he says, every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes, the what it takes refers to money. And the guys who've been desperate for land never get their land because whenever they have a choice to make about what to do with their money, either a night with a woman or an evening gambling with friends, takes priority and takes the money. So as Crooks observes it, people choose human companionship over the longer-term dreams that they have of owning their land. Carlson is really interesting because Carlson doesn't initially seem like a lonely character, but he has no connection with the other men really. And when George says that the men who go around on ranches get mean, you can kind of see that Carlson's heading that way. He has no empathy for Candy. Candy loves that dog, and Carlson is more bothered by the fact that it stinks than he is by Candy's dependence and care for the animal. He has no empathy. He insists on shooting the dog, And at the end of the novel, when he goes away from George and Slim, he says, now what the hell you suppose he's eating them two guys? You see that he has no empathy for George when George has just been forced to shoot his best friend. He's got no idea what George might be upset about. But there's something else interesting about Carlson. After he shot the dog, when Candy's talking about the incident to George, Candy says, I should not to have let no stranger shoot my dog. And I think that's really interesting. Having lived with Carlson and worked with Carlson probably for months, Candy describes him as a stranger. And I think that says so much about the lack of connection between the two men. They've lived together, they've worked together, they're still strangers. We've been talking about Candy, we carry on with Candy. Candy's only companion is that dog, and when he loses it, he immediately seeks to join in with George and Lenny's partnership and George and Lenny's dream. His loneliness is compounded by fear of his old age. He says that a guy on a ranch don't ask no questions and he don't listen. The whole thing about life on the ranches is about isolation and about not asking too many questions, not getting too close to other people. And then he talks about his dog. I had him so long, had him since he was a pup. I herded sheep with him. That's not just talking about the fact that the dog used to be young and fit and capable. It's also symbolic of the fact that Candy used to be young and fit and capable. And like his dog, he has aged and become infirm. When he's talking about joining in with the dream, he talks about wanting to hoe in the garden after he ain't no good at it. He's realistic about the fact that he can't do much, but what he really wants out of this is companionship and a safe space for being an old man. And that's the bit he regrets after the death of Curley's wife, when the whole thing is off. The fact that he could have been with them, he could have hoed in the garden with them. Slim seems to be the only character who's capable of being kind and empathetic without having a friend, actually. Slim doesn't have anybody that he has that kind of connection with. He talks to George, or rather he listens to George. He never actually says anything about himself. So the friendship he offers George is very undemanding, very self-sufficient. Slim doesn't give much of himself away. But he has this understanding of the human condition, and some of the comments he makes about the loneliness he has seen. I hardly never seen two guys travel together, and he's the kind of person who would notice. And he comments that nobody ever seems to give a damn about nobody else, that he's used to seeing a society where people don't care about each other, possibly because life is competitive. But he also says maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. Maybe that reflects on the competitive thing. Maybe they're scared that somebody will get some advantage over them. But Slim's wisdom seems to be kind of standing back and observing other people's loneliness. One of the most lonely characters in the whole novel is Curley's wife. She's obviously isolated by the fact that she's the only woman. We never know what happened to Curley's mother, but Curley's wife is the only woman. She's inevitably lonely. Her marriage is unhappy. She says that Curley ain't a nice fella, and that's after only 2 weeks of marriage. And she exists in a culture of misogyny and fear, which isolate her even further. She is disliked, despised, feared by the other men, even as much as she is sort of an object of reluctant fascination to them. They do go into the whorehouses on Saturday nights. They are interested in her, but they see her as jailbait, they see her as a trap, they see her as dangerous. So there's never going to be any kind of companionship for her there. She tells us she's lonely when she goes in to visit Crooks. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time? Rhetorical questions, but obviously quite passionately felt. She talks about Curley, that he's a swell guy, spends all his time saying what he's going to do to guys he don't like, and he don't like nobody. That's in the context of the fact that by now Lenny has crushed Curley's hand, and she's got a bit more freedom. She's got a bit more agency of her own once Curley's hand has been crushed, and she's aware of it. But she's aware that she's been abandoned for the night, that her husband has gone into the whorehouses of Soledad with the other men, and she's left behind talking to Crooks, Candy and Lenny. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs, and that's the point that she calls them quite derogatory names. She refers to them as a nigger and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. Quite a cruel way to describe all three of them, particularly poor old Candy, referring, I think, just to the whiteness of his hair, but also making him sound rather stupid. But she says she's liking it because there ain't nobody else, which again is kind of a bit of an insult. When she gets Lenny on his own in the barn just before he kills her, she seems not to understand the reluctance of the men to talk to her. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to anybody. And when Lenny says that she's going to get him into trouble, she says, what kind of harm am I doing to you? She really doesn't seem to understand the danger that she poses, the risk that she is to the other men on the ranch. And after she's died, this is the point where Steinbeck describes her not through the eyes of one of the characters, but just through his own stance as a narrator. And he talks about the fact that the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention are gone from her face. And that's where he tells us really that she was desperate for attention. She was lonely. All she ever wanted was somebody to listen to her, somebody to talk to her. So there we have it, lots of characters who are lonely in one way or another.